Wow. What's up everyone? Welcome back to Shredcraft RC. I'm Cam, and today I wanted to do a deeper dive into RC drift car alignments. So, got a little makeshift studio so you can kind of see better lighting under the tire and what these alignment changes do. First off, what I wanted to do is show you some of the tools you can use for this type of thing. So I wanted to show you guys a couple different ways of doing RC drift car alignments. So of course we have the iRacing alignment rack. This is a more complex setup and not something that I actually use all the time, but I use a camber gauge, have this in my pit bag, use this pretty much every time I'm at the track. And then, so I want to show you how I do a simple alignment and then show you how I do a more complicated alignment. Now I made some changes here with electronic placement and some other things to kind of entice more roll and just testing. That's all this is. I don't have an exact setup, but I have reasons for doing things the way I do them. And then we have the rookie drift here. There's no electronics on it, but I'm going to use this as a demonstration car to show you bad examples, what not to do. Right now it's set up with box stock settings. And then later on we'll talk about scrub radius, different wheel setups, stuff like that. So I have a bunch of information that I wanted to share that kind of expands on the previous video I made, the RC drift alignments. So this is going to be a little more in depth and talk about some theories and some concepts, and then I'm going to try to show you some better shots of what these settings actually do while you are tuning. I'm going to get the camera set up and let's get right into it. I got both cars here, and the one on the left I've kind of set up in the wrong fashion to show you what not to do. The car on the right has a basic alignment on it, but still needs to be put on the rack. So what we're going to do is bench align one of these as if you were at the track using simple tools. Now before we get started, there's a few things we need to talk about as far as terminology. I hope some of you have the basics, but if not, here's a quick overview. Front of the vehicle is facing this way, and we have the front wheels. This car has kind of a neutral to toe out, slightly toe out, meaning that the front of the wheel is pointed out slightly on both sides. And here, for demonstration purposes, not how you should ever run your car, but this has a lot of toe in, so the front of the tires are pointed in, and that's not a great setup for drifting, not a setup you should even want to do. If your car looks like this, you have some bigger problems going on. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was camber. So camber is the way that your wheel leans when you're looking at it from this direction. This car, if you can look at the front wheel here, it has negative camber. The top of the wheel is pointed in and the bottom is out. And the same thing on the rear, there's a slight amount. Now on this car, I've set it up to have positive camber. If you can see here, the top of the tire is sticking out and the bottom of the tire is pointed in. So that's called positive camber, not what you want. And the last of the most common of the three alignment settings is caster. And that is the angle from where your arm mounts to the lower hub and then mounts to the top of the hub. So that angle, that is your caster setting. On an RC drift car, it is changed by usually moving shims on your control arms on the upper and lower arm to move the arm forward and backward, either upper and lower, to create more lean in that front knuckle. We've gone over toe, camber, and caster. And now I'm sure there's some other terms you've heard floating around with RC drift alignments. KPI, kingpin inclination. It's from the mounting point from the top of your hub to the bottom of your hub, so that angle. As you can see, this hub has KPI built in, meaning the top and lower mounting points are offset, so this top mounting point is set in while this remains parallel. And then scrub radius is another one. Scrub radius is going to be the radius at which this wheel rotates, and basically your scrub radius is controlled by the offset of your wheel. So usually there's a number stamped on the inside, and then also by the size of the hex that you run. And since these are the adjustable offset hubs in here, there's spacers that click in, so you can make that a wider hex. But since most of my wheels are wide, I have it on the smallest, which ends up being like a 4mm equivalent. And then these wheels, I believe, are 7s or 8s. So still a pretty wide wheel. So the scrub radius, when you have a wider wheel on this hub, is going to rotate on a wider arc. Having a wheel with a low offset where the wheel is going to sit closer in and have a narrower arc. Now there's a fine balance in finding the proper offset for the width of your chassis, because you have to fit the body you're going to run, but you also have to make sure you have clearance on the back end that the wheel isn't going to run into and rub the back of these arms. This car still has stoppers where it will stop the wheel, but like cars like the Rookie Drift, this has a very wide offset wheel, and it also stock comes with a very wide hex. It also comes with curved turnbuckles to help clear the wheel down here, but there's ways around that. So this is the car with a messed up alignment, and I'm going to get that set up with the basic tools, and we're going to go over a quick alignment, show you where I start and what I change to what settings and why, and then I will put this car on the alignment rack and we'll go over a full kind of pro tune, if you will, on the settings on that car. Get this set up and I'll be with you in a sec. So here I've got my simulated setup, and all I'm going to need for this is my turnbuckle wrench and my camber gauge. So normally if you get a car like this, a Rookie Drift 2.0, the alignment settings that come out of the box are usually pretty good. Now this car comes with full adjustable turnbuckles, which makes it super nice to dial it in for the feeling that you want. Now when you're learning to drift, I like to suggest starting with a basic simple tune. Typically the toe in the rear on these cars would set up with these toe blocks. This is how you would adjust toe for the rear arms. So you would have a shorter distance in the front to toe it in. Now on a drift car you do want toe in, and typically from the factory these cars will come with usually 0.5 degrees of toe in the rear. What I'm going to do is start in the rear because there's less moving parts. I've got the other camera set up pointed at this arm, and as we saw before, this car has a lot of positive camber, and what we want to do is maximize the contact patch that we have down here to the inner half of the tire along its movement, because if you didn't realize already, but drift car wheels move as the body rolls. So you want to have your battery and of course your electronics. This chassis doesn't, but for simulated purposes we're going to pretend that it does, and we're going to check out what these rear camber arms do after we get our camber into a range that we like. So I like to tell people, you're drifting, these wheels move, don't run 0 degrees. What I tell people, go to -2 degrees at a minimum, up to -4 degrees. Depending on how you have this rear camber link set up, and I will show you why when we get there. But what I'm going to do is switch to the other camera. I will make my adjustments. I already know that this is pretty out of whack, so I'm going to bring the camber closer to 0, and then I'll show you how I'm using this gauge as I'm dialing it in further. This wheel has too much positive camber, so I'm going to start bringing this turnbuckle in, and usually there's a little line that will direct which side has the normal thread and which side has the reverse thread. And on this chassis, I can see turning up is going to take it in. So I'm going to give this a few good spins here. It'll probably equate to a full rotation and a half. And I'll see if you guys can see if that wheel has started to come into negative. I'm going to show you what the camber gauge will do. Bring the camber gauge in. And if we set this up to 0 degrees, let's see if we can frame this up a little better. There's 0, and see how there's a gap still at this wheel. So I'm gonna just hold it here and I'm gonna fill that gap. So now this is even with the wheel, giving me a camber readout here. Something you don't wanna do. So I'm still just above 0, maybe 1 degree or so. So if I leave that there, and I'll do my best to hold the chassis here. So if you can see that as I turn the turnbuckle in, I'm essentially shortening this turnbuckle here, and that wheel is pulling in. Now in the rear, between -2 and -3 degrees. So I'm going to set this one up at let's say 3. So we'll see where we're at here. And it's about 2, go a little more. All right, we're going to call that 3. So I'm going to leave this camber gauge the same, and I'm going to bring it over. Well, I know I'm at -3. And now we have our other out of whack wheel. And if I set this here, we can see that gap at the bottom. Now that's telling me I have a lot of positive camber. Do the same thing on this side, shorten this up, and see if you can see that wheel move. I probably could have a better turnbuckle wrench, but this is simulating a track alignment. If you can see there, there's actually a little gap at the top, so I went a little too far. Sometimes I'll bounce the suspension, recheck it, and that's looking pretty spot on. So now I can bring this back over to the other side just to check, and it's pretty much on. So that is my rear camber set. Since the rear toe is already set by the toe blocks, I don't have to worry about it in the rear, and that's why I like to start in the rear. It will kind of get everything square and set. And so now if I bring the camera down a little further, so this will be easier to focus on one tire at a time. But if you look right here, there's a gap under that tire because we just set this tire to -3 degrees static. So let's look at it when this side of the shock gets loaded up as if it were drifting into a corner. Now you can see that that contact patch flattens out and it rolls to the center of the tire. So that's kind of telling us that we're right in range because we're going to get all the use from here to here of the tire, giving us the greatest contact patch. So this is a stock camber arm setup. And what happens is it picks up a little bit of camber under compression. And then if we're to drift to the outside, it picks up a little bit of camber under the release. So a pretty neutral setup. Now, what were to happen if we raised this mounting point to the hub is what we'd be doing is we'd be creating more squat. So the tire would lean in more under compression, but having that point higher as we're drifting, this wheel's not going to move as much. There'll be less camber reduction on your leading wheel. So that leaves a more consistent patch. As you can see, this tire is going to roll, and of course the car's not going to load that much, but for visual reference you can see how much that tire is going to roll from negative to positive camber. So by changing these points, you can change how that reacts under load and then as it becomes uncompressed, as well as how much camber gain changes when it squats. So these inner holes are more going to change your roll center, and your roll center is the line in which these bottom hinge points of where your hub mounts to the lower arm, if you're to draw a horizontal line through that, and then you take a horizontal, or you take a line from the point at which it mounts to the top of the hub to where it mounts on the bulkhead, and you draw that line all the way across to where it crosses with your horizontal line here. And then you draw a line from that, you draw a line from your contact patch on the opposite wheel up to where those 2 points cross somewhere in space on the outside of the wheel here. And where those two lines cross, typically somewhere in the lower part of the chassis here, is considered your roll center. Where these two lines intersect from your mounting points from the hub to the chassis is called your instant center. That's where the chassis will roll to. Your roll center is the point at which everything's rolling from. If you take your line from your instant center to your roll center, you get a distance. That's your fulcrum giving you leverage on how much roll that car is going to have. From what I've learned from the racing guys is this changes a lot when you're grip driving, because you can have the car drive in the track by lowering your roll center, or you can drive on the track by raising your roll center, which is going to roll the chassis more, and you're driving on top of the track. That's kind of my understanding. With today's trend of high battery mounts and high CG, it's more than just mounting the battery high, but allowing the chassis to roll and use that higher center of gravity and a higher roll center to create the traction to your outside tire as the car loads and unloads. So for me, I like to run pretty much neutral. On my other car, which I'll show you, I do run quite a bit of camber gain under squat, which allows the loaded up wheel to remain more consistent while I'm drifting. And since we're drifting, we're not going straight. Everything I'm referencing and how the car drives is going to be in a corner because we're drifting. So I'm going to move to the front and show you how I align the front if I were at the track. Over here with the front end of the car, I don't know if you guys remember, but yeah, the front end, pretty toed in, pretty pigeon-toed. Definitely not what we are looking for when we're drifting. And for this step, I would recommend having a set of digital calipers. Usually good tool to have in general, keep it in the pit bag. You're going to want to measure your turnbuckles. So since this is pretty pigeon-toed in, I'm going to go ahead and start getting these more to a neutral or zero toe position. And then we'll talk about Ackerman and toe and caster and how everything kind of plays together, because when you adjust one thing, you're also changing another one of these measurements ever so slightly. So I'll get to wrenching this real quick, and since these are obviously too long, pushing the back of the hub out since it's a rear steering rack, I am going to shorten these. Again, with the line on the turnbuckle, I know which way to rotate it. And we'll give that kind of a full spin there. And then we'll give this one in. And you can kind of see we're already back to that neutral-esque position. So what I like to do is I will take calipers here and I'm going to measure the turnbuckle distance. So 19.2 on that side, 19.4 on that side. So I'm a little out of whack. And the reason I'm using this is just to make sure that they're even. What I'm doing visually is checking at the front of the wheels and to see if they're pointed in or out. You want your front of the wheels typically pointed out just a little bit, because you always want some sort of force on the tires when you're driving. Tip from real drifting. So I know this one's just a little longer. I can take that in just ever so slightly. Basically, we are set to about zero toe. And when you're going through toe, when I'm looking at it from above, I'm looking straight down. I'll take a look that this wheel's pointed out a little, take a look that this wheel's pointed out a little, and you can go ahead and rotate it through its sweep. And things that I look for on your trailing wheel is the inner edge lining up with the shock. This is going to be part of the Ackerman sweep. Ackerman is a rate, it's not a number, but an Ackerman basically means it's at the rate at which these two wheels are turning together. If you were to have totally parallel Ackerman, both these wheels would turn at the exact same rate. Because of the steering rack and the alignment, we like to have positive Ackerman, meaning that your leading wheel, this wheel, is going to turn more than your trailing wheel. And since this wheel is being loaded up because the car is drifting in this direction, when it's in this position, your weight is going to be on this wheel. And with that, we want to have the largest contact patch possible at the angles that we're drifting at. We have our kingpin inclination, we have our caster adjustment, the forward and backward mounting positions of the arms, and all of that plays together on this rotation to see where your tire is completely flat, meaning that you're going to have the most traction, gaining more front traction with this lead wheel having a bigger range of having a flat contact patch. One of the things, if you have too much caster, let's say over 10 degrees, your wheel, when it gets to full lock, you're going to be jacked. The car's going to jack up on the suspension because you're rolling to the outside point of this tire, and it's going to lift the chassis. It's something that you can't really avoid completely, but you can make changes by bringing your caster down a little bit, say to the 7 to 5 degree range, and then adjusting your camber so that when your wheel, let's say, is 45 or 50 degrees, is completely flat on the ground. And then that will minimize the camber gain on jacking at full lock, and it will also minimize the camber gain as a trailing wheel, so you still have contact patch with a wheel that's very light while you're drifting. Just kind of like a train of thought I like to have, where I don't like to concern myself too much with Ackerman as long as my lead wheel is turning more than my trailing wheel. Something that I've seen with maybe the bell crank on this chassis is that it will actually go negative Ackerman, and the trailing wheel, if I go to a zero toe alignment, will seem to turn more than the lead wheel. See if I can get a shot from above, but let's continue with the alignment really quick because there's not much more After we get our toe to where we want it, we're going to take our camber gauge again, and we're going to check our camber. Now in the front, I like to run between 8 and 10 degrees of camber. And it looks like right now this is about 9, so it's about in the sweet range. Now I'm just going to check this other side really quick, and it looks like it's about the same there. So always a good tool because you can throw it on the tire real quick or throw it on the wheel and just see if your alignment's within spec. Also, measuring with the calipers, making sure that your arms are even side to side, big key. Just have those tools readily available, and then you know if something's drastically out of whack. 9 times out of 10, you can look at your chassis visually without having to measure anything or pull any tools out and see if one wheel's turned way more than the other. Or let's say this wheel's pointed way out while this wheel remains straight. I know there's a problem with the rear toe turnbuckle, or the turnbuckle on the back here. Something to look out for if you're having some weird driving issues. The other thing is if you go toe out in the rear, that's something you're not going to want to do in a drift car. We're going to try to simulate that because right now we have toe in the rear with our toe blocks. So this tire essentially is pointed in slightly. Now let's say that we're drifting, and we're going to be drifting this direction, and the chassis rolls and we're sliding. This wheel's going to create forward bite because it's still pointed in the direction of the chassis. So that's going to want to pull the chassis in as you're drifting, because drifting is essentially physics. So we're reducing friction with our momentum moving in that direction, and our friction on these tires is pulling us away from this camera. So if this wheel is pointed out and you go to drift, the other wheel is also pointed out, and as you're drifting, this wheel, if it's pointed that way, is going to pick up way more wheel speed than your trailing wheel that's pointed in the opposite direction of your drift. What that will do while you're drifting is spin you out. So if you have that problem, make sure you have rear toe in, because that's going to help create forward bite. A lot of real drift cars, they're tuned that way as well, because as you create pigeon toe effect as this car's rolling, these tires are digging in and biting and creating forward bite. So that in tune with your camber and your camber gain will create the contact patch that you're physically drifting on as the car is loaded up and drifting. So let's again take a look at this Ackerman sweep from above. As you can see, this leading wheel is turning more than the trailing wheel across its sweep. And if this hits the stops, it's the same thing. So, see if I can do that from the servo. That is what you're looking for with the drift car. And in the rear, slight toe in, slight bit of negative camber, and you're gonna have a good time. That was a quick little bench alignment. I'm gonna go ahead and get this rack set up, and we'll get the other car on, and then I will show you how to utilize this tool in your shop. Got the car on the Racing alignment rack, and I made some changes to the rear end. Go ahead and flip this around and show you. But something that I'm trying is with the camber arm, you can see how much more of a steep angle this is at. So actually, if I want to change the instant center, I can actually just raise this one hole, and I'm going to try that along with the different springs that I'm running. So this is it's a little bit softer than a stock RDX spring, but a little bit stiffer than the reveD medium spring. That, along with the high mount battery and the mid mount ESC. If you noticed, back to Hobby Wing, I'm going to be doing some brand ambassadorship with Hobby Wing this year, so be on the lookout. Those rear camber arms I changed. I also replaced the ball cups because it had been a year, so they are out of whack, and my alignment rating is on the front here. So I can already just see I'm running about -2 degrees, and that one's probably more like -3 degrees. So with the amount of roll I have this chassis set up to do right now, I'm going to set these at -3 degrees. I'm going to go ahead, get that done. Basically what I'm going to do is I'll leave this one where it's at, and I'm going to dial this one in with the turnbuckle wrench here, and I may need 2 hands to do this, set this back on the tripod. I'm going to go back and forth. I'm going to bounce the suspension a couple times to let it settle in and then see where those readings are. And on this car, I am running toe blocks, and I'm running a 1.1 degrees of toe in the rear, and I know you're not going to be able to see that on camera. I'm going to go ahead and get this camber adjusted before we move on to the front end, and we can go into a little more detailed run through on what all these measurements and meanings correlate to. Here you can see I got that rear tuned in right at -3. I like to give the chassis a little bounce, let it settle right at -3. Again, chassis settled. Let it bounce right at -3. I'll go ahead and move this to the front end and see where we're at here. So onto the front end here. In this part, it's going to be important to have a battery in and plugged in, have your remote on, have everything centered and zeroed, because this is pretty important when it comes to drifting and having accuracy and feeling, especially making sure that you have adjustments on both ends and not just maxing your steering trim out one way. Now, I've recently switched the servo in here and I haven't programmed it yet. So if I go to turn the car on, watch what's going to happen. I didn't center the servo before hooking it up. And that's kind of a common problem that I see with people online, is they're asking, why is my car turning one way more than the other? And sometimes this might be part of the problem. And I'm here to try and find some solutions for you. So what I'm going to do is I can turn the wheel and kind of see that I still have play. So I could, in theory, adjust this with trim and bring my wheels back to straight. But knowing how an RDX bell crank works and knowing that I can adjust center points on this servo digitally, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I will get this centered out, and then I'll show you what the next steps are from there. Okay, I'm squared up on the steering here. If we take a look at both wheels, it looks like this one's running about -8 degrees, and over here looks like we're about the same. Camber is pretty even, but if I were to change toe on one arm, you would notice that the camber would change. And to read toe on these, we have this acrylic board that has a dial, and then there's slots back here, same thing on the other side, and this sits on top of the rack. And as you slide it one way, I can get the toe on this wheel, and as I slide it this way, I can get the toe on this wheel. I'll go ahead and show you guys what that looks like from above. So if you guys can read that reading here on the acrylic plate with the dash on the wheel mount, we're about 3 degrees positive toe. And then if I bring this over to the other wheel, and sometimes I give this a little tap out just to make sure it's all the way out, but that one only has 1 degree of toe out. So what I need to do is adjust the toe rods or double check my steering centering, because it could just be that the steering is off 1 click, and I'll need to go through and check that. Essentially, you're going to want to make sure both wheels are center, check them multiple times, and then go back and check your camber on each wheel to make sure that, and I can see that that wheel was turned more. Servo's not wanting to center. That's still 1, and that one's still about 2 or 3. So I'll have to go through and check that. But then you come back and you check your camber to make sure that those are even after you make toe changes, because all of these settings kind of relate to each other. So once you get that toe dialed in and make sure it's equal on both sides, you want to come back, check your camber, make sure that your camber is also equal on both sides. Let's say that it's not. Let's say that this one's reading 7 and this one's reading 9. If you need to add more negative camber to this wheel, since an RDX just has spacers, what you can do is you can change the spacers or remove the spacer to gain more camber. Since the RDX is fixed plastic upper arms, if you're at a point where you have to adjust that much to where you're removing or adding more shims, you probably have something bigger going on, or something messed up with your arm mount. On the lower here, since I do have these reveD arms, they are adjustable and there's a turnbuckle, and I can micro adjust the bottom to fine-tune camber with these arms on this chassis. Also have the front toe blocks on here, basically just set to a stock setting, and then on the rear toe block back there, I have a 1mm shim under the block to give me an anti-dive alignment. And when you do that, you reduce caster So you need to compensate your caster by adjusting your lower arm or your upper arm forward or backward, depending if you need more or less caster. And I will show you how to read caster next. So on the side of the outracing alignment rack here, we have a dial which is in degrees. And what this is for is measuring your caster, like I said before, on your hub mounting points. So we're going to put our 2mm into the top of the ball joint here and then see where that reads on the dial. Now, you can wiggle these around in the mount, so I like to see the limit on both ends and then kind of find the middle and see where that's going to sit. So this is telling me I'm at, 5 degrees, 5.5 or 6 degrees of caster, maybe a little more, probably 6ish range. Vague on how far the dashes are apart, but I'd say I'm more back here at this point. And what caster does is creates more stability in the corner while you're drifting. While this wheel, well, my servo's on, but while this will be good to see. At static camber, you saw that I was at -8 degrees. Because of the caster, as this wheel turns, you can see this wheel starts to flatten out all the way to 0 right there, and then back up to -8. Of course I'm jacking the rack back there, but that kind of just shows you that your leading wheel does flatten out across the sweep. So caster, somewhere in that range. I don't think you want to go anywhere closer to 0, but I want to go any more than 10 degrees of caster on the front end, unless you're doing some wild geometry changes, of course, or you're trying some experiments, because that's what tuning's for, just finding what feels best for you. So I can give you guys all my numbers and my full alignment spec here, but drifting and the feel of your car are so subjective that anyone could put these exact same tunes onto their cars and might not like the way they feel. So I encourage you to experiment, to play around, to change one thing, go spin a few laps, change it again if you don't like it. If you're going in the wrong direction, go completely in the other direction and start testing. So that's what I'm doing here. I used to have my ESC on the back. I had the battery down lower and across the chassis. Now the battery is parallel, the ESC is in the middle. I have a higher roll center, different electronics, and a different front end alignment. I'm going to try this out, and if it doesn't work, I could be wrong, but that's what this is. This is tuning, and you're never going to know unless you try something. And I can sit here and tell you in a video of what's working for me, and it might not work for you. But if you're running on polished concrete, I can say that this feels very nice to me, and other people might have a different opinion. So take it with a grain of salt. You don't need to copy everything exactly, but I hope that you can see how making very little changes can have drastic results. And I'm going to go ahead, put the wheels back on, and then I can show you some of these measurements working together in unison with the wheels on, and we can go from there. We got the wheels back on the car. I kind of wanted to show you guys how these measurements and this geometry all works together in unison to kind of give you a better contact patch when you're drifting. Now, granted, it's not that much different from stock. I think what I've done is I've taken out a little bit of camber and reduced a little bit of caster. These are the reveD RDX knuckles and the reveD RDX aluminum bell crank. I do have a 2mm spacer on the rack on the rod. Basically, that's giving me a more parallel acronym instead of leaving that trailing wheel open more. So both wheels will kind of turn the same. And now I have the camera down here because I want you to look at the contact patch of the tire here. See how you can see that gap under it? That wheel goes flat there, and then it jacks just a little here at the end. So again, I'll see if I can turn this so you can see it at an angle. But as that lead wheel transitions, you can see how flat that contact patch is. And that's going to give me the most amount of grip there, because this from probably here to here is where we're doing most of our driving while we're drifting. A little bit of jacking at full lock, which is good because that's going to help pull the car. But then when you let go, it's also going to help self-steer the car with that caster, pulling the wheel back to a straight line. And then again, having negative camber and a little bit of toe out on the front is going to provide enough force on these wheels to keep them facing out. Where that hex is mounted to the wheel on the face, that is going to be our scrub radius. So this is nothing special. This is probably a little larger than what comes on most stock RC drift cars, depending on the wheel offset you're running. Like I said, I believe these are 8s, and I have wheels, I have 6s, 8s, 12s, and 9s, I believe. So I can check the offset depending on different setups, and I like to play with this stuff quite often, so I do change it up quite a bit. For now, I'm excited to see how this steering feels on track, and then when we flip it around here to the rear and we take a look at where this rear is rolling from, so you can see those camber arms moving, and then take a look at the contact patch under the tire. As it leans, it doesn't move as much as it did on the RD 2.0. So here on the RDX, having that hub camber arm mounted all the way at the top, down here at the bottom, mounted all the way to the bottom. And then my next move when I go to the track is I'm going to move this inner camber arm up one hole just to test the roll and see how I like it. So under squat, gains camber, but under drifting, that wheel isn't doing a whole lot. And this is going to depend on your diff setup, of course. This diff is very open, where I can sit here and I can spin this wheel while I hold the other wheel. So that being said, on tighter corners, while this car is drifting, this wheel is going to be receiving all the lock, while this wheel is going to be open. And you can actually see it in some video clips where the trailing wheel is almost stopping because the diff is opening up. So just something that to note, gear diffs, you may find that you like having this wheel gain more camber while it rolls. That's just something to play with. These are easy enough adjustments just by moving these camber links and then rechecking your camber. Again, -2 or -3 degrees in the rear is probably all you need, unless you're doing something wild, kind of out of the ordinary. Then maybe you're going to run way more negative camber because that tire is going to roll a lot more. So those are just kind of my thoughts there on the rear. And then the front, I'm going to go through my notes and see if I'm forgetting anything, and then I'm going to come back to you guys with a conclusion and a follow-up on both these chassis and getting a good, decent alignment set up on your RC drift car. So I went ahead and went to the track and I tested out some of these settings. I gotta say the front end felt great. There was tons of steering when I wanted it. The front contact patch felt definitely good for where it's at. Might be able to make it a little more aggressive just by taking a little more toe out, more of a parallel steering, but that's something I'll play with more in the future. I did test out the rear camber links here. I did go back to the bottom position on the chassis. I did have it in the upper hole, but I felt like the car might have been a little more loose. For me, it felt better being in this lower hole and then the upper hole in the hub. So that's where I'm at for now. And then my other note was that the rear springs were a little stiff, so I went back to the reveD medium, and these are the reds. So I believe those are for 900 grams of rear weight, which this car is still maybe slightly lighter than that. I'm in the process of getting my ESC back together. I did have a reverse polarity pop and popped the cap, so took the capacitor off and then have a new one coming. Got that off for now. There was just a few pointers I forgot to mention, I guess, when I was going over other terminology. One of the big ones I did forget was bump steer. And bump steer is controlled by your tie rod, and your tie rod connected from the steering rack to the hub. And you want that to be as parallel as possible to your lower arm, so that the wheels don't change the amount of toe that they get throughout the suspension travel on the car. Something to look out for. It's usually changed and tuned by adding spacers on the hub, either under or above the ball joint, to change the angle at which that meets the hub. But the general rule is keeping that as parallel as possible. It will yield the best results. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to list all my alignment settings here. And like I said before, these might work for some people and others might not like them. Tuning your RC drift car is very subjective, so tune to what feels good for you. I hope that some of these explanations helped you. Maybe you were able to visually see the difference in the contact patch of the tire and what those different changes in the alignment do for your steering and for the grip of your chassis. Overall, I hope that helped you to better understand your RC drift car setup. I know this was a long one, and for those of you that watched until the end, thank you guys a lot. Really appreciate it. And big thanks to all those new subscribers coming to the channel to better understand their RC drift cars. Make sure you hit that thumbs up button below. And if you like what you see, subscribe for more awesome RC content from Shedcraft here. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you on the next one.